Spring of 1945. On a Pacific island already stripped of foliage and mercy, American infantry moved cautiously toward a position that refused to announce itself. There was no towering concrete silhouette, no visible gun emplacement. The defense revealed itself only when the ground began to answer back. Earth had been carved, packed, reinforced. Timber was layered beneath the soil. Steel was hidden where blast and shrapnel would never find it. The bunker had not been built to intimidate. It had been built to last. The first artillery rounds struck with expected violence. Dirt leapt skyward, shockwaves rolled across the surface. When the smoke thinned, nothing essential had changed. The structure remained intact, not because it was strong in the conventional sense, but because it yielded in the right places. Earth absorbed force. Wood bent without snapping. The bunker did what it was designed to do: survive. Below the surface, Japanese defenders waited in silence. They did not rush to fire. They did not expose themselves unnecessarily. Their doctrine favored patience over reaction. Air flowed through narrow tunnels. Orders were passed quietly, by memory and routine. Each man understood that endurance was the weapon. Time, not firepower, was expected to decide the engagement. American gunners adjusted their aim. Barrages intensified. Larger shells were brought to bear. Still, the position refused to collapse. When infantry finally advanced, resistance appeared with deliberate precision. Fire emerged from concealed angles. Approaches that looked clear moments earlier became lethal. Progress slowed, then stopped. Another assault pinned down by a defense that could not be seen, only felt. To the officers watching, the pattern was painfully familiar. This bunker would fall eventually, but only after hours of attrition, measured in casualties. It was winning by not dying. Exactly as intended. Then authorization came for a different approach. Not a heavier shell, not a longer barrage. A weapon whose effects were still imperfectly understood, even by those deploying it. There was no single explosion when it arrived. No immediate collapse. Instead, fire entered the structure. The bunker did not shatter. It ignited. And as the flames spread where blast never could, the logic of protection itself began to turn, setting the stage for a transformation no fortification had been built to withstand. What struck the bunker was not an explosion in the way soldiers understood explosions. There was no outward blast wave tearing structures apart. No single violent moment that announced destruction. Instead, the weapon arrived and began to move. Fire spread laterally, deliberately, as if searching for space rather than creating it. It did not punish exposure alone, it punished enclosure. The flames behaved unlike anything the defenders had trained against. They did not leap and vanish. They clung. Liquid fire adhered to surfaces, rolled along walls, and followed gravity into openings that shells had ignored. Where conventional weapons rewarded distance, this one exploited proximity. Where fragmentation dissipated, this fire remained. Almost immediately, oxygen became the enemy. Air that had once sustained life inside the bunker was consumed with speed and indifference. Heat rose not in a single wave, but as a growing pressure that pushed smoke ahead of it. The tunnels, carefully engineered for airflow and concealment, now accelerated the attack. Ventilation shafts fed the flames. Narrow entrances drew fire inward, transforming into chimneys. Depth, once the bunker's greatest strength, turned against its occupants. Each additional meter underground delayed escape and amplified exposure. Fire traveled faster than men could move, faster than orders could be passed. The design that had resisted artillery now ensured that heat and smoke reached everywhere that mattered. The defenders did not see the attack coming because nothing in their experience resembled it. There was no preliminary barrage to signal danger, no gradual escalation that allowed adjustment. The fire arrived fully formed, exploiting geometry rather than force. Firing ports became entry points. Protective angles became conduits. Inside, orientation collapsed. Smoke erased distance. Sound lost meaning. Communication failed not because of damage, but because breath itself became scarce. Discipline, so carefully cultivated, had no doctrine for this moment. Waiting. The strategy that had carried them through countless bombardments offered no protection now. Above ground, the structure remained largely intact. From a distance, it looked almost unchanged, but functionally, it was finished. The fortification had not been breached, it had been inverted. Everything meant to keep danger out now kept it in. In that inversion lay a revelation still forming at the edge of understanding. If fire could be made to live inside defenses, then the very idea of shelter in modern war was about to be rewritten. For years, Japanese defensive doctrine in the Pacific had been shaped by a single hard-earned lesson. Survival depended on endurance and concealment. Open positions invited annihilation. Mobility exposed units to air power. The answer was to disappear into the earth and remain there. What could not be seen could not be destroyed, at least not easily. Across the islands, underground networks grew more sophisticated with every campaign. Bunkers were linked by tunnels. Firing positions were offset and hidden. Depth was measured not only in meters, but in confidence. Shells could pound the surface for hours while the defenders waited below, counting impacts, trusting that firepower would eventually exhaust itself. Conventional weapons reinforced this belief. Artillery punished exposure. Bombing shattered anything rigid and visible. Those who stayed buried survived. Patience became proof of strength. Time favored the defender who could endure longer than the attacker could sustain losses. Napalm reversed that logic without warning. It did not demand exposure to be effective, it required enclosure. Fire entered where blast could not, and once inside it rewarded depth with intensity. The very features that made underground defense resilient narrow passages, controlled airflow, layered protection now amplified destruction. The deeper a position lay, the more lethal its conditions became. Heat accumulated. Smoke had nowhere to disperse. Each turn of a tunnel delayed escape and magnified disorientation. What had once bought time now consumed it. Endurance ceased to matter when survival depended on movement that doctrine forbade. Withdrawal, already discouraged, became physically impossible. Routes that led outward carried flame inward. Communication lines failed under heat and suffocation. Orders could not travel faster than fire. In some positions, men never reached the entrances they had memorized so carefully. Protection turned into confinement. Safety became enclosure. The ground that had promised survival now denied it. From above, the fortifications still appeared formidable. From within, they became final. And as reports filtered back through the chain of command, a realization began to spread. The battlefield had changed not because walls were weaker, but because the meaning of cover itself had collapsed. Japanese island defense in the Pacific did not emerge from theory alone. It was shaped by defeat, observation, and adaptation under relentless pressure. Early battles had demonstrated the futility of contesting American firepower in the open. Air superiority erased movement. Naval guns punished visibility. Every attempt at maneuver invited overwhelming response. Survival required a different answer. That answer was fortification. As campaigns progressed, Japanese commanders abandoned the idea of flexible defense and embraced static resistance. Movement was replaced with preparation. Instead of meeting the enemy forward, they waited beneath him. The battlefield was reshaped, not by advance, but by excavation. Hills were hollowed. Ridges were tunneled. The ground itself became the front line. Terrain was no longer something to fight over, it was something to inhabit. Natural features were integrated into defensive networks until the distinction between landscape and fortification disappeared. Caves became bunkers. Bunkers became systems. Each position was designed not to dominate space, but to deny it. If the enemy could not see the defense, he would have to pay to find it. Depth became synonymous with survival. Every additional layer of earth was another barrier against blast and fragmentation. Every turn in a tunnel absorbed shock and confusion. Firepower, it was believed, had limits. Shells ran out. Bombers moved on. What endured was what lay beneath the surface, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. This belief was reinforced repeatedly. American bombardments were powerful, but rarely decisive on their own. Positions that appeared destroyed often came back to life once infantry approached. Firepower punished exposure, not concealment. The lesson seemed clear. Time favored those who could endure punishment without responding impulsively. Psychological endurance was therefore elevated to a strategic principle. Soldiers were trained not only to fight, but to wait, to remain silent, to accept confinement as a form of strength. Death was expected. Collapse was not. A position that held even briefly was considered successful if it delayed the enemy and imposed cost. Defense, in this logic, was not meant to win battles outright. It was meant to prolong them. Each island was a calculation of attrition, designed to slow the American advance and sap its will. If assault could be made expensive enough, perhaps negotiation or exhaustion would follow. By 1945, this approach had hardened into certainty. Fortifications were no longer supplemental. They were the strategy itself. Maneuver was seen as vulnerability. Depth was protection. Endurance was virtue. The enemy's advantage in firepower was acknowledged, but it was believed to be finite, predictable, and ultimately survivable. What Japanese planners did not fully consider was the possibility that firepower itself could change, that a weapon might emerge, which did not exhaust itself against earth and timber, but fed on them. And as the war entered its final, most brutal phase, that assumption was about to be tested in a way no doctrine had prepared for. By the final year of the Pacific War, American commanders faced a contradiction they could no longer ignore. Their material superiority was unquestioned. Their air power dominated the skies. Their naval guns could deliver destruction measured in tons per minute. Yet, again and again, entrenched Japanese positions survived punishment that should have erased them. Artillery and bombing shattered surfaces, but resistance endured beneath them. From the air, targets appeared neutralized. From the sea, hills were pulverized. But when infantry moved forward, fire returned with lethal accuracy. Machine guns emerged from unseen angles. Riflemen fired from positions thought destroyed hours earlier. Bombardment suppressed movement, but it did not eliminate defenders who had no intention of exposing themselves. The cost fell on the infantry. Assaults against fortified positions produced casualties that felt disproportionate to the ground gained. Platoons advanced yard by yard, often against enemies they could not see. Progress was measured not in breakthroughs, but in bodies evacuated. Victory, when it came, was local and temporary. Terrain compounded the problem. Jungle restricted visibility. Volcanic rock blunted explosives. Narrow ridges and ravines limited maneuver. Tanks, so decisive elsewhere, were reduced to supporting roles or immobilized entirely. Armor could not pursue an enemy that refused to move. Firepower could not finish what it could not reach. As a result, each fortified position became its own battle. No collapse followed success. No chain reaction spread along the line. Taking one bunker revealed another. Clearing one ridge exposed a network beneath the next. There was no front to break, only a series of hardened nodes, each demanding attention, time, and blood. Time increasingly favored the defender. Every delay allowed Japanese forces to prepare the next position. Every pause exhausted attacking units and stretched supply lines. Momentum stalled not because of resistance everywhere, but because resistance existed exactly where it was needed most. Within American headquarters, frustration hardened into urgency. Commanders understood that repeating the same methods would not change the outcome. More shells meant more craters, not fewer defenders. Longer bombardments meant greater exhaustion, not faster collapse. The problem was not insufficient force, it was misapplied force. What was needed was leverage. A way to collapse resistance without paying for every meter. A tool that could reach into fortifications rather than batter their exteriors. Something that punished concealment rather than exposure. Escalation, under these conditions, did not feel reckless. It felt logical. Each new weapon system was evaluated not by novelty, but by whether it could solve the problem that artillery and courage could not. The question was no longer how much firepower could be applied, but how it behaved once it arrived. Somewhere between frustration and necessity, American command crossed a quiet threshold, and in doing so, they prepared to adopt a weapon whose effects would redefine what a defended position truly meant. Napalm did not enter the Pacific War with fanfare. It was not announced as a revolutionary weapon. nor introduced as a solution to the growing stalemate against fortified defenses. In its earliest appearances, it was treated as a supplement, another tool among many, useful in specific circumstances, but not decisive on its own. At first, its purpose seemed almost mundane. Tests emphasized its ability to clear vegetation, to burn away jungle cover that concealed enemy movement and observation. In a theater where foliage could hide entire units, fire was simply another way to expose what lay beneath. Napalm was filed mentally alongside flamethrowers and incendiary shells, dangerous but limited. Its true potential was underestimated, not out of ignorance, but habit. American doctrine was still oriented around blast, penetration, and fragmentation. Weapons were judged by how effectively they destroyed structures or killed exposed personnel. Napalm did neither in the conventional sense. It did not punch through armor. It did not level buildings. It burned. Chemistry, however, was moving faster than tactics. The thickened fuel behaved in ways that field manuals did not yet describe. It adhered to surfaces. It resisted extinguishing. It flowed rather than detonated, but doctrine lagged behind these realities, framing napalm as an auxiliary asset rather than a transformative one. As a result, early authorization for its use was cautious. Limited deployments, specific targets, narrow objectives. Commanders were told not to expect miracles. Napalm was meant to assist infantry, not replace traditional methods. It would soften resistance, not collapse it. Expectations remained modest. No one anticipated that a weapon designed to burn foliage might fundamentally alter the balance between attacker and defender. There was no assumption that it could succeed where artillery had failed. At most, it was expected to save time at the margins to make difficult assaults slightly less costly. Then, reports began to return from the field. Positions subjected to napalm did not behave like those hit by high explosives. Resistance ended faster, survivors abandoned defenses sooner, structures that had withstood hours of shelling became untenable in minutes. The effects were not always visible from above, but they were decisive where it mattered inside. Commanders reading these after-action reports struggled to reconcile them with existing assumptions. Napalm was doing something no other weapon had managed consistently. It was not overpowering fortifications. It was invalidating them. The weapon's impact lay not in destruction, but in transformation. What had been approved as a limited experiment was quietly becoming something else. Without public debate or dramatic declaration, napalm was proving that the problem of entrenched defense could be solved not by more force, but by different behavior. And as understanding caught up with experience, the war was about to enter a phase where fire would no longer be a supplement to assault, but its defining instrument. The first fortified positions subjected deliberately to napalm were not selected for symbolism. They were chosen out of necessity. Hardened defenses that had resisted bombardment, absorbed infantry assaults, and imposed delays measured in lives now stood in the path of advancing units. Commanders authorized napalm not to make a statement, but to solve a problem that had proven stubbornly resistant to every other solution. When the weapon was deployed, its effects were immediate and unfamiliar. Instead of collapsing walls or burying entrances, the fire entered them. Thickened fuel flowed into firing ports that had been designed to deflect blast. It followed gravity into trenches and crawl spaces. Where tunnels connected positions for mutual support, the flames used those same connections to spread. The geometry of defense became the pathway of attack. Resistance did not build gradually, it ended abruptly. Gunfire that had pinned units down moments earlier ceased without warning. Firing ports went silent. Positions that had been expected to fight for hours fell quiet in minutes. There was no counterattack, no final stand. The change was not subtle enough to misunderstand. Inside the fortifications, shock replaced doctrine. Men trained to endure bombardment found themselves confronting something endurance could not outlast. Heat intensified rapidly. Smoke erased direction. Fire advanced faster than orders could be given. Faster than discipline could reassert itself. Survival ceased to be a matter of courage and became a matter of seconds. Those who escaped did so early, abandoning positions long before ammunition ran out or casualties mounted. Withdrawal, once unthinkable except by order, became instinctive. The calculation shifted from holding ground to finding air. Some defenders fled through secondary exits that had never been used under fire. Others did not make it that far. Communication collapsed underground. Telephones failed as heat damaged wiring. Runners could not navigate passages filled with smoke. Command posts lost contact with forward positions almost immediately. In systems designed to function without movement, paralysis set in as soon as movement became necessary. Above ground, the results were difficult to reconcile with prior experience. The fortifications were still there, hills remained intact, bunkers showed little visible damage, yet the defense had dissolved. Not suppressed, not delayed, dissolved. Infantry advanced cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, encountering positions already abandoned or rendered inert. What astonished observers was not just the speed of collapse, but the absence of prolonged combat. There were no repeated assaults, no incremental gains. A position that had been expected to consume an entire day fell within a single engagement. Casualties dropped sharply on one side and rose catastrophically on the other. Officers and engineers studying the aftermath struggled to explain what they were seeing using existing frameworks. Firepower had not increased dramatically. The number of weapons employed was limited, but the effect was disproportionate. Napalm had not overwhelmed defenses through volume. It had bypassed their logic entirely. Reports circulated quickly. Units that had endured weeks of attritional fighting took note. Commanders adjusted expectations. What had once been considered an experimental support weapon was now being evaluated as a primary means of reducing hardened resistance. The implications were unmistakable, even if their moral weight had yet to be fully reckoned with. Something fundamental had shifted. The contest between fortification and firepower, a contest that had defined much of the Pacific War, was no longer balanced. The Earth itself could be turned against those who hid within it. Survival no longer depended on how well a position was built, but on whether it could be abandoned in time. As these lessons spread along the front, a new understanding took hold. Modern fortifications could still stop shells, but they could no longer keep fire out. And once that realization settled in, the character of assault warfare was permanently altered. Napalm revealed a truth that conventional warfare had long obscured. Not all weapons need to defeat armor to render it irrelevant. Thickness no longer mattered in the way planners had assumed. Earth, steel, and concrete still stopped shells, but they offered no resistance to fire that behaved as a liquid. Napalm did not test how strong a structure was. It tested how it was shaped. The weapon exploited airflow with ruthless efficiency. Defensive systems had been engineered to breathe, to circulate air, to disperse smoke, to sustain men underground for long periods. Those same channels now guided flame. Ventilation shafts accelerated combustion. Pressure differentials pulled heat deeper into the network. What had once sustained life now fed destruction. Geometry became destiny. Turns in tunnels, meant to absorb blast, trapped heat. Narrow passages, intensified temperatures. Interconnected chambers ensured that fire introduced at one point migrated rapidly to others. Defensive design did not merely fail to stop napalm, it carried it. Timber reinforcements, chosen for flexibility under bombardment, ignited readily. Wooden beams that had absorbed shock for months now burned steadily, prolonging heat long after the initial attack. Fire did not need to find defenders immediately. It needed only to find structure. Once the bunker itself was burning, survival inside it became impossible. Oxygen depletion followed quickly. Flames consumed breathable air faster than it could be replaced. Smoke displaced what little remained. Even in sections not directly touched by fire, men collapsed from asphyxiation. Consciousness failed before escape could be attempted. Defense systems designed to function without visibility now denied their occupants the most basic requirement for endurance. Escape routes, carefully planned and memorized, turned lethal. Entrances drew fire inward. Exits became funnels of heat and smoke. Some routes were blocked not by collapse, but by temperature alone. Passing through them meant certain death. Others led to the surface only to expose men to waiting infantry. The bunker offered no safe direction. What made napalm uniquely effective was not speed alone, but persistence. High explosives delivered a moment of violence. Fire delivered duration. Heat lingered. Smoke remained. Structures continued to burn long after the initial strike. Even if defenders survived the first moments, the environment itself became uninhabitable. Engineers studying these effects came to an unsettling conclusion. The problem was not insufficient protection, it was too much of the wrong kind. Fortifications optimized against blast had created enclosed systems with predictable airflow, combustible supports, and limited exits. Every rational engineering choice made sense against shells and bombs. Against napalm, those same choices compounded vulnerability. Fire had become a structural weapon. It did not attack defenders directly at first. It attacked the system that sustained them. Once the structure failed as an environment, resistance ended automatically. No command decision was required. No surrender needed to be negotiated. The defense ceased to function because life could no longer exist inside it. This realization marked a turning point in how military planners understood fortifications. Protection without mobility was no longer protection at all. Depth without flexibility became a liability. The more carefully a position had been engineered for endurance, the more efficiently it now delivered heat, smoke, and suffocation to its occupants. For those observing the battlefield, the implications were unmistakable. Napalm had transformed fire from an external threat into an internal one. Walls still stood. Hills remained intact. But the concept of shelter had been hollowed out from within. As these lessons spread, they raised a question that would soon dominate planning on both sides of the conflict. If engineering itself could be turned into a weapon against its builders, how long could any fixed defense remain viable in modern war? Japanese defensive systems in the Pacific had been engineered for permanence, not adjustment. Once constructed, bunker networks were meant to be occupied until destroyed or abandoned by higher command. Tunnels were fixed. Firing ports faced predetermined sectors. Escape routes were limited by design. Flexibility, in the Western sense, was considered unnecessary and often dangerous. This rigidity was not accidental. Retreat contradicted doctrine at every level. Positions were not viewed as temporary holdings, but as obligations. Withdrawal risked disorder, exposure, and loss of cohesion. More importantly, it threatened morale. To abandon a fortification without orders was to admit failure before defeat had been proven. Endurance was the measure of discipline. Against artillery and bombing, this mindset had proven effective. Firepower could be waited out. Shelling eventually lifted. Aircraft departed. Survival rewarded patience. Units that endured emerged intact enough to fight again. The lesson was reinforced repeatedly. The longer one stayed underground, the better one's chances. Napalm shattered that assumption. Fire could not be outweighted. It did not exhaust itself against earth and timber. It fed on them, waiting increased exposure. Remaining still meant inhaling smoke, absorbing heat, and losing oxygen. The discipline that once preserved life now accelerated death. Countermeasures did not exist. There were no internal fire suppression systems, no protective equipment for sustained heat and smoke, no alternative ventilation routes once primary channels were compromised. Even improvised responses blocking tunnels, sealing doors often worsened conditions by trapping heat and consuming remaining air. Communication failed almost immediately under these conditions. Smoke obscured vision. Heat damaged wiring. Sound lost direction. Orders could not be transmitted reliably once the environment itself became hostile. Commanders underground lost contact with each other and with the surface. Coordination collapsed not because of confusion, but because survival took precedence over control. Adaptation requires learning. Learning requires observation, adjustment, and repetition. Napalm denied all three. Its effects were often fatal on first contact. Units did not survive initial exposure long enough to analyze what had happened, much less develop new tactics. There was no cycle of engagement and revision, only abrupt termination. Those who did escape carried fragmented knowledge. They knew only that shelters had failed. That depth had betrayed them. That waiting no longer worked. But without time, resources, or doctrinal permission to alter defenses fundamentally, these insights could not be translated into effective change. Fortifications already built could not be rebuilt under fire. By the time the nature of the threat was understood, it was already too late to respond meaningfully. Positions were occupied by necessity, not choice. Men entered bunkers knowing they might not protect them, but lacking any alternative. The system compelled participation, even as its logic collapsed. Survival became unlikely not because of a lack of courage or resolve, but because the framework that governed behavior no longer aligned with reality. Doctrine had assumed a world where firepower struck from outside and faded with time. Napalm created a world where danger lived inside the defense and intensified the longer one stayed. In that world, adaptation required abandonment of positions, of assumptions, of deeply held beliefs about endurance and honor. Such change was impossible in the midst of battle. And so the defenders remained where they were, committed to structures that had ceased to function as protection. As this pattern repeated across island after island, it became clear that the collapse of Japanese defenses was not a failure of will, but a failure of compatibility. The war had changed faster than doctrine could follow, and fire had found the space doctrine left behind. There came a point in the Pacific War when the rhythm of assault changed. Positions that had once demanded days of preparation, bombardment, and incremental advance began to fall within hours. The shift did not announce itself with a single, decisive battle. It emerged gradually, then unmistakably, as a pattern. Resistance did not vanish everywhere at once. Some defenses still fought with ferocity. Others collapsed almost immediately. The unevenness itself was revealing. Where fortifications had relied most heavily on depth, enclosure, and patience, collapse came fastest. Where terrain allowed limited mobility or early withdrawal, resistance lasted longer. The difference was no longer courage. It was compatibility. Casualty ratios began to shift sharply. American infantry, long accustomed to paying heavily for every bunker and ridge, advanced with fewer losses. The reduction was not absolute, nor was it bloodless. But the trend was clear enough to be noted in after-action reports and medical tallies. Where napalm was used effectively, assaults concluded sooner and with fewer Americans carried rearward. For the defenders, the effect was catastrophic. Losses were no longer spread across prolonged engagements. They occurred rapidly and in concentrated moments. Units ceased to function not because they had been outmaneuvered, but because their positions became uninhabitable. Death came from heat and smoke as often as from bullets. Survival depended on escape that doctrine and design rarely allowed. Infantry tactics adapted accordingly. Advancing units no longer expected to fight every bunker to exhaustion. Instead, they moved with grim efficiency, isolating positions, applying fire where it would be decisive, and advancing once resistance collapsed. The emotional burden did not lessen, but the uncertainty did. Soldiers began to trust that defenses would not hold indefinitely. Command recognized the implications quickly. Napalm was no longer treated as a situational asset. It was integrated systematically into assault planning. Targets were selected not by visibility, but by structure. Bunkers, caves, and tunnel networks became priorities. Fire was applied not to punish, but to render resistance impossible. This integration altered the calculus of defense. Fortifications lost their deterrent value. What had once imposed delay now invited rapid neutralization. A bunker no longer promised safety through endurance. It promised exposure to a weapon that functioned precisely because endurance had been designed into it. Momentum followed naturally. Advances accelerated not because resistance disappeared, but because it no longer dictated tempo. The attacker chose when and how positions would be reduced. Time ceased to belong to the defender. Each successful assault shortened the next by reinforcing confidence and refining method. For Japanese forces, the psychological impact was as damaging as the physical one. Reports of positions collapsing under fire spread quickly. Confidence in shelter eroded before contact. The idea that a bunker guaranteed survival could no longer be sustained. Fear entered places where discipline had once ruled. From a strategic perspective, the change was decisive. Campaign timelines compressed. Objectives once scheduled weeks apart were reached days earlier than planned. Supply and reinforcement cycles adjusted to a faster pace. The war itself seemed to accelerate, drawn toward an outcome that no longer depended on attritional delay. Yet this turning point carried a weight that commanders did not ignore. Effectiveness came at a moral cost that was impossible to calculate neatly. The same weapon that spared one set of lives magnified suffering for another. Victory became more efficient and more terrible. By the time the pattern was fully recognized, it could not be undone. Assaults were shorter. Resistance was broken faster. The logic of fortification had been overtaken by a logic of fire that rewarded speed and punished enclosure. The battlefield had crossed a threshold. Defense no longer promised delay. Shelter no longer guaranteed survival. And as momentum shifted irrevocably toward the attacker, a deeper transformation followed, one that would soon reach beyond tactics and into the minds of those still preparing to fight. The most decisive change brought by napalm was not always visible in rubble or terrain. It unfolded quietly, inside the minds of those expected to defend fixed positions. Long before the first flames entered a bunker, confidence had already begun to erode. The shelter that once represented survival now carried doubt. Defenders no longer trusted their fortifications in the way doctrine demanded. Bunkers had been built as psychological anchors as much as physical ones, places where men believed they could endure bombardment and emerge to fight. That belief weakened as reports circulated of positions that burned from the inside, leaving little chance for resistance or escape. Shelter no longer meant safety. It meant uncertainty. Morale began to erode before contact. Units occupying newly completed defenses knew what had happened elsewhere. They understood, at least in outline, how fire had turned protection into confinement. Waiting underground no longer felt like discipline. It felt like anticipation of suffocation. The battle was no longer something that began with the enemy's arrival. It began with the expectation of how it would end. Underground safety became illusory. The earth still absorbed shells, walls still held. But these familiar reassurances rang hollow. A position could appear intact while being functionally dead. Men listened for sounds they could not interpret, aware that silence might mean fire had already entered the system. The absence of explosions no longer brought comfort. The idea of endurance, so central to Japanese defensive thinking, began to fracture. Endurance required time. Napalm denied time. It punished waiting. The longer one remained inside, the worse conditions became. This inversion undermined not only tactics, but identity. Soldiers trained to equate patience with strength now faced a threat that rendered patience fatal. Fear accelerated collapse in subtle but powerful ways. Positions were abandoned earlier. Fire discipline weakened. Communication faltered, even before smoke filled the tunnels. Some defenders fled at the first sign of attack, convinced that survival depended on movement rather than obedience. Others stayed too long, trapped by the same hesitation that doctrine had once rewarded. Resistance shortened accordingly. Engagements that might once have stretched across days compressed into hours or minutes. The sequence of battle changed. Instead of bombardment followed by assault, collapse often preceded contact. Fortifications ceased to shape the fight. They merely delayed its conclusion. From the attacker's perspective, this psychological shift was unmistakable. Infantry encountered fewer determined last stands. Positions were found empty or silent. The absence of resistance did not always feel like victory. It felt like something had been broken, irreversibly, something beyond the physical structures. The mental battle had been lost first. Once defenders ceased to believe in their shelters, the rest followed inevitably. Weapons mattered less than expectation. Firepower mattered less than fear of confinement. The decision to hold or flee was made internally, long before any order could be issued. This collapse of confidence had strategic consequences. Defensive planning relies on predictability, on knowing how long a position will hold, how much effort it will require to reduce. When fortifications lost psychological power, they lost strategic value as well. A bunker that might be abandoned at first contact could no longer be relied upon to delay an advance. By the late stages of the campaign, the Japanese defense faced an impossible contradiction. It depended on fortifications that no longer inspired confidence, manned by soldiers who understood their limitations too well, Courage remained. Discipline remained. But belief, the invisible foundation of endurance, was gone. As the war moved toward its conclusion, this unseen transformation weighed heavily on both sides. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by terrain and weapons, but by the collapse of faith in protection itself. And once that faith was gone, the outcome of each engagement was decided long before the first shot was fired. By the final months of the Pacific War, napalm was no longer an experiment or an auxiliary option. It had become standard practice, not because of enthusiasm and not because of ideology, but because it worked where nothing else had. In a conflict increasingly defined by fortified resistance and shrinking margins for delay, effectiveness carried its own authority. Orders reflected this reality. Napalm was incorporated into assault planning as a matter of routine. Positions once assigned to prolonged bombardment were now scheduled for fire application early in an engagement. The intent was no longer to weaken defenses gradually, but to render them uninhabitable outright. Speed replaced attrition as the governing principle. Yet ethical unease followed closely behind tactical success. Commanders understood what the weapon did, not in theory, but in consequence. Reports from the field made clear that napalm did not simply defeat positions, it annihilated the conditions necessary for survival within them. Victory came faster, but it came wrapped in a form of destruction that was difficult to reconcile with traditional concepts of battle. This unease did not halt its use. It complicated it. Decisions were framed as balances rather than absolutes. How much devastation was acceptable to shorten an assault? How many lives could be spared on one side by magnifying suffering on the other? These were not questions with clean answers, and they were rarely resolved explicitly. They were absorbed into planning assumptions and left unspoken. Commanders increasingly measured success in time saved. Faster assaults meant fewer opportunities for counterattack. Shorter engagements reduced fatigue and preserved momentum. In this calculus, napalm offered clarity. It compressed decision-making by removing uncertainty. A fortified position subjected to fire was unlikely to hold. The outcome was no longer in doubt, only the timing. Casualty patterns reflected this shift with brutal symmetry. American losses declined in engagements where napalm was applied effectively. Infantry moved forward sooner, encountering less resistance. The reduction was not total, but it was consistent enough to shape doctrine. For planners responsible for thousands of lives, the arithmetic was impossible to ignore. On the other side, casualties intensified dramatically. Defenders trapped within fortifications faced conditions that offered little chance of survival. Death was concentrated rather than prolonged. Entire positions were neutralized in moments rather than worn down over days. The asymmetry was stark, and it weighed heavily even as it accelerated progress. As fortifications ceased to function as obstacles, the battlefield itself began to compress. Engagements covered smaller areas over shorter periods. Campaign maps that once anticipated long pauses between objectives were revised repeatedly. Advances that had seemed ambitious weeks earlier became achievable within days. Space and time collapsed together. This compression altered the psychological experience of war. For attackers, the pace allowed little recovery between engagements. There was less waiting, less uncertainty, but also less distance from consequence. For defenders, the sense of inevitability deepened. Positions no longer promised delay. They promised only a brief interval before fire arrived. Strategically, the effect was cumulative. Each accelerated assault fed the next. Supply chains adjusted to faster movement. Command structures adapted to shortened timelines. The war itself began to feel as though it were rushing toward its conclusion, propelled not by a single decisive blow, but by the erosion of resistance everywhere it remained fixed. Napalm did not win the war alone, but it removed one of the last effective means of slowing it. Fortification, once the backbone of Japanese defensive strategy, lost relevance. Without the ability to impose delay, defense lost leverage. What remained was a shrinking window in which to resist. By the time this reality was fully acknowledged, there was no returning to earlier methods. The weapon was too effective to ignore, too integrated to abandon. Ethical discomfort persisted. but it existed alongside a recognition that the alternative prolonged assaults fought bunker by bunker carried its own moral cost. As the Pacific War moved toward its end, fire became an accepted instrument of resolution, not celebrated, not denied, simply used. And in that quiet acceptance lay a final, unsettling truth. When a weapon shortens war by destroying the very idea of shelter, the line between necessity and excess becomes harder to see. The conflict was accelerating now, drawn forward not by diplomacy or exhaustion alone, but by a form of power that left no space for defense to breathe. Those who survived encounters with napalm underground struggled to describe them in conventional terms. Many recalled heat before sound, not the shock of an explosion, but a sudden, enveloping pressure that seemed to arrive everywhere at once. It pressed against skin and lungs simultaneously, leaving no clear direction from which to flee. Smoke followed almost immediately. Thick, choking, disorienting. In the confined geometry of tunnels and chambers, it erased distance and direction. Familiar passageways vanished within seconds. Men who had memorized their positions in darkness lost all sense of orientation. Walls could be felt, but not understood. Breath became shallow, then desperate. Resistance ended not with surrender or final volleys, but with silence. Firing ports that had crackled with life moments earlier fell quiet. Commands went unanswered. In some positions, no bodies were found near weapons or exits. Death had come where men stood or lay, overtaken by heat and suffocation before movement was possible. After the fighting moved on, the underground remained. Bunkers still stood. Tunnel entrances yawned open, dark and impassive. Inside them were bodies that could not be reached without risk. Heat lingered. Smoke clung to enclosed spaces long after flames were gone. Recovery was often impossible, and frequently not attempted. For those advancing above ground, victory carried weight rather than elation. The absence of resistance did not feel like triumph. It felt like aftermath. Soldiers understood that positions had been neutralized without a fight in the traditional sense. The silence they encountered was not the silence of retreat, but of finality. Memory lingered in those spaces, even when the war moved forward. The knowledge of what lay beneath the earth traveled with the units that advanced past it. There were no celebrations at cleared bunkers. No photographs taken beside captured positions. The ground itself seemed to resist acknowledgement. For commanders, reports reduced human experience to figures and outcomes. Positions eliminated, casualties sustained, time saved. But beneath those summaries lay realities that did not translate cleanly into operational language. The cost of speed was carried invisibly by those who had endured the fire and by those who had applied it. Japanese survivors who escaped burning positions carried memories marked by confinement. Many spoke later of the moment they realized endurance no longer mattered, that waiting was killing them faster than fighting ever had. Survival, when it came, arrived through abandonment of position, of doctrine, sometimes of comrades who could not move. The cruelty of war became undeniable in these encounters, not because violence was new, but because it was inescapable. Fire left no room for negotiation or adaptation. It did not distinguish between bravery and vulnerability. It punished design as much as decision. In doing so, it stripped conflict down to its most elemental truth. Victory achieved under such conditions felt incomplete, necessary perhaps, even decisive, but heavy. There was no illusion that speed erased suffering. It merely concentrated it. The war continued to move forward, but it carried with it spaces that would never be revisited, sealed beneath the surface with their human contents intact. Long after the battles ended, the underground remained a silent ledger of cost, unmarked, unrecovered, unspoken. The earth that had promised protection now held memory, instead memory of heat, smoke, and the moment when shelter ceased to exist. In those buried spaces, the moral clarity of victory faded. What remained was a reminder that war does not only destroy bodies and terrain, it alters the meaning of safety itself. And once that meaning is lost, it does not return easily, even when the fighting finally stops. Napalm did not simply add another weapon to the battlefield. It changed the meaning of several words that armies had relied on for centuries. Fire was no longer only a means of destruction applied from the outside. It became structural, a force that worked through design, geometry, and environment rather than against them. For the first time, protection without mobility proved fatal. Fortifications had always assumed that survival meant staying put, allowing violence to pass overhead. Napalm inverted that assumption. Survival now depended on the ability to leave. A position that could not be abandoned quickly was no longer strong, it was dangerous. Defense that demanded endurance without escape became a liability rather than an asset. This shift permanently altered defensive doctrine. The logic of fixed resistance, already strained by air power and artillery, could not survive fire that lived inside shelter. Fortifications would never again be designed on the assumption that time alone favored the defender. Delay without flexibility was exposed as a dead end. Engineering itself had to change. Military construction could no longer focus solely on blast resistance, thickness, and concealment. Chemistry entered the equation. Materials mattered differently now. Airflow could no longer be treated only as life support. Enclosed systems had to account for heat, smoke, and the behavior of fire under confinement. What had once been neutral design choices became matters of survival. Future fortifications reflected these lessons. Mobility was prioritized. Escape routes multiplied. Compartments were isolated to prevent spread. Materials were reconsidered. The idea of a single, deeply buried stronghold gave way to dispersed, flexible systems that could be abandoned as easily as they were occupied. Protection became temporary by design. Beyond engineering, napalm shifted the boundaries of war itself. Power became less visible, more absolute. Destruction no longer required collapsing structures or leveling terrain. It required only the denial of habitability. A position could remain standing and still be defeated completely. The battlefield grew quieter even as it became more lethal. This invisibility altered how violence was experienced and remembered. The absence of rubble did not mean the absence of suffering. The lack of spectacle did not imply restraint. Fire worked internally, leaving landscapes deceptively intact while erasing the possibility of resistance beneath them. Strategically, this change reinforced a broader trend. Modern warfare was moving away from contests of position and toward contests of systems. Victory depended less on where forces stood and more on whether the environments they relied upon could function. Napalm was not unique in this regard, but it was among the first weapons to make the shift unmistakable. In retrospect, its impact extended far beyond the Pacific Islands of 1945. It forced militaries to confront an uncomfortable truth: that the safest-looking solutions were often the most fragile, and that protection divorced from adaptability could be turned inward with devastating effect. What napalm really changed was not just how wars were fought, but how safety itself was understood. Shelter could no longer be assumed to be neutral. Endurance could no longer be trusted as a virtue on its own. Power no longer needed to announce itself through collapse or noise. It could work quietly, relentlessly, from within. As armies studied the ruins that still stood and the bunkers that could no longer protect, a final lesson emerged, one that would echo into future conflicts. In a world where fire could live inside walls, survival belonged not to those who built the strongest defenses, but to those who could move beyond them. And with that realization, the age of permanent shelter in war came to a close, replaced by a more unsettling understanding of power, one that required no breach, only presence. Japanese fortifications in the Pacific were built with care, intelligence, and purpose. They were not crude obstacles, nor desperate improvisations. They were the product of study, of earlier defeats, of enemy firepower, of the brutal arithmetic of survival. Earth was shaped to absorb blast. Timber was chosen to flex under shock. Depth was calculated to outlast bombardment. In this, they succeeded. Against everything else, artillery could pound them for hours without decisive effect. Bombs shattered the surface and moved on. Infantry assaults were slowed, redirected, exhausted. The defenses did what they were meant to do. They endured. Napalm did not defeat those fortifications by breaking them open. It did not breach walls or collapse roofs. From the outside, many positions appeared intact even after the fighting ended. What napalm changed was not structure, but function. The bunkers stopped being shelters. They became containers. Fire entered the spaces that had been engineered to protect life. It moved through ventilation, meant to sustain breath. It fed on materials chosen for resilience. The more carefully a position had been designed to endure punishment, the more efficiently it now held heat and smoke. What had once resisted destruction now preserved it. Shelter became confinement. Depth became delay without escape. Endurance, the central virtue of the defensive doctrine, became fuel. The longer a position was held, the more lethal it became. Survival no longer belonged to those who waited, but to those who fled early enough to reach air. This was the final inversion. Defense did not merely fail. It turned against those who relied upon it. The ground itself became hostile. Walls that once inspired confidence, now inspired dread. Protection demanded immobility at precisely the moment mobility became essential. There is no satisfaction in this outcome. No clean resolution. The effectiveness of napalm shortened battles and reduced casualties for those advancing, but it did so by concentrating suffering in places where escape was least possible. Victory came faster, but it came heavier. In the end, the tragedy was not that Japanese defenses were poorly conceived. It was that they were conceived perfectly for a war that no longer existed. They were built to endure fire from outside. They were never meant to survive fire that lived within. This is the lesson that lingers beyond tactics and timelines. War does not always defeat its adversaries by overwhelming them. Sometimes it changes the rules so completely that the strengths of one moment become the vulnerabilities of the next. What once protected life can, under new conditions, ensure its destruction. Napalm did not merely accelerate the end of fortified resistance. It erased the meaning of fortification itself. It revealed that safety is not inherent in walls or earth, but in adaptability. That endurance without escape is not courage, but entrapment. They built their defenses to endure fire. They never imagined fire would live inside them. And in that final miscalculation lies the quiet, enduring cruelty of modern war. That survival depends not on how strongly one can hold, but on how quickly one can recognize when holding has become the most dangerous choice of all.